Okay, hello. It is October, which means it is time to talk October anticipated reads. It is also 80 degrees at time of recording, so if you see me start to sweat, no you didn't. But before we jump right in, go ahead and like and subscribe if you feel like it, and go ahead and leave below what titles you're excited for this month, whether we discuss them today or not, because while we have, I believe, over 40 books today to talk about, I know, strap in, there are many that I am not going to be covering today. It is a huge release month, so share what you're excited about. Let's talk up these books. Looking at the math, this month we have just a hair over 40 books. Last month we had 35 plus, just a hair over 35 books, which means that we have slightly over 75 books just between September and October. So these are definitely very concentrated publishing months. Additionally, we have the benefit of spooky season and the fall reading season. So we're going to be seeing a lot of atmospheric, spooky, gothic kind of reads coming out this month. So there's a lot to talk about today for sure. So let's go ahead and jump right into October 3rd, our first New Book Tuesday of the month. I also apologize because I'm probably not going to fix the framing of the video today, but I realized that my hands are like much closer to speaking with my hands than they usually are because I have a little table with my computer in front of me so that I have these titles easy at hand. And the first novel of October 3rd I've got my eye on is The Other Princess, a novel of Queen Victoria's goddaughter by Denny S. Bryce. This is a kind of reclaiming of the narrative and story behind real historical figure Sarah Forbes Bonetta, who was a kidnapped African princess who was presented to Queen Victoria. And while Queen Victoria seemingly took a liking to Sarah, as Victoria was wont to do, Sarah was often kind of trotted out as an exotic trophy, but she was also incredibly charming, and that, along with her aptitude for language and music, kind of helped her navigate the court at this time. So this novel seemingly follows the course of her life and is going to be perfect for fans of historical fiction, especially historical fiction that kind of reclaims the narrative of these historical figures. I'm personally, obviously indicated by its inclusion in this list, excited for this one. And then we have The Forest Demands Its Due by Kosako Jackson. Obviously, the forest in here is a pretty clear indicator that I am going to be interested in this title, but this also seemingly has elements of dark academia and is billed as A Lesson in Vengeance meets The Taking of Jake Livingston, which is a kind of clear picture being painted with those comp titles. And it follows Douglas, who goes to this elite remote boarding school, which is a renowned institution for its kingmaking. Then a student is murdered, and Douglas is the only one who even remembers this student existed outside of the groundskeeper's son, Everett. And in his effort to uncover the truth around this, he uncovers a centuries-old horror in the forest. So here we have those elements of potentially social commentary, especially with the emphasis on kind of the political power, the social capital and power of this institution, combined with it being surrounded by this forest and the idea of what can be hiding there. So there is obviously so much potential here, and I am always a sucker for a forest, as you probably well know at this point. Then, staying in line with the kind of dark academia kind of theme, which is going to be pretty prevalent this month because it is October, we have Curious Tides by Pascal Lassalle. This has been getting a decent amount of buzz. It follows a young mage at a prestigious university of magics, though her healing abilities have historically been somewhat mediocre. Until that is a night in some caves by the sea leave a bunch of her classmates dead and her as the sole survivor. And this night leaves her with some mysterious powers that could put her life in danger if the wrong person were to discover them. So she pairs up with the reclusive student Baz, whose sister also happened to be Anne-Marie's best friend before this tragic accident, and their investigation leads them to some suspicions of a cult-like group on campus. And then these students who had drowned in this horrific accident start washing up on shore alive, only to die of like tragic magical incidents following this. And so this leads Emery to needing answers even more urgently as her powers become more visible to those in society at large. So there is definitely the potential for a really intriguing, dense, kind of darkly magical world here. I am very excited to dive in and see what the voice is going to be here. I'm hoping for kind of that lyrical darkness, to say again, but it's, you know, it's that specific vibe. You know what I'm talking about. So very high hopes for this one. And then we have Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll, which has been pretty buzzy. This is the author of Luckiest Girl Alive, and this is a kind of recentering of the women in the sorority that were at the center, or at least a fictionalized account of the women in a sorority targeted by, in real life, Ted Bundy. Potentially controversial opinion, but I don't think it is. I actually didn't like Luckiest Girl Alive. I thought that the pacing was really slow. We spent a lot of time dangling this twist or this reveal at the end of the book, and that was supposed to be the carrot that kept us going, but there wasn't a lot in the rest of the book that really made it worthwhile or made me really want to keep reading. But despite that, Jessica Knoll really has popped out as a particular voice, and I think that this book is obviously part of a larger trend and interest in true crime that we've been seeing for years and years. And it also makes me think of books like The Girls by Emma Cline, which was a reimagining of the women associated with the Manson cult. So it's this kind of lightly fictionalized exploration of these stories, these true crime stories that have really captured our attention. The ethics of that, like how much are we kind of shifting this narrative, recognizing that these were real people, real victims that had real families, so how are we approaching that within this fictionalized form? I think our kind of conversation around true crime has progressed a lot within the last couple of years, and I will be interested to see if this book actually takes on any of that commentary and conversation as well. In the same way that I Have Some Questions for You by Rebecca Makkai earlier this year really did try to grapple with some of those questions and kind of dig into our kind of obsession with these stories. However, it's also seemingly coming at this from the angle of the women victims kind of reclaiming their story and their full humanity in wake of these tragic events, and especially with this story, however fictionalized, our tendency to center the perpetrator of these horrific crimes rather than focusing on the lives he stole. So with all that being said, this narrative has a lot of potential and a lot of potential pitfalls as well, but I am hopeful that it offers a voice to these women and engages and grapples with something a little bit heftier. And hopefully because of that, the prose is a little bit more propulsive as well, and the thing has a little bit more shape. However, I also worry that because it is based on real life in some way, in whatever way, that it may lean too heavily on that in order to kind of keep it moving. And so I'm very interested just to see what the final form of this looks like. It's admittedly probably not super high on my TBR until I hear more feedback from others regarding it, and I'd probably be more likely to listen to this on audio. So I don't know, I'm anticipating a lot of conversation around this book, and this seems to be like one of the buzzier fall titles, the more kind of mainstream fiction. It's that kind of bridge, it lives on that line between literary fiction and thriller, so I think it's going to see a lot of popularity, and because of that, I think we'll see a lot of conversation around it, which will help me direct whether I actually want to pick it up or not, so I will keep you posted. And then we have Midnight is the Darkest Hour by Ashley Winstead. This takes place in a very religious community in Louisiana where the librarian Ruth has always felt like an outsider, despite the fact that her father is essentially like the fire and brimstone preacher of the community. But as the blurb says, in addition to fearing God and the devil, this community also fears a lot of the myths and legends that haunt the area, including myths of a figure called the Low Man, who is compared to a vampire of sorts that will steal into the bedrooms of sinners at night and kill them. So when a skull is found in the swamp with mysterious symbols etched into it, Ruth is put on a path of trying to uncover the true evil in this community and figure out what is going on. So I'm just going to read the end of the blurb in terms of the thematic explorations here, because I really am interested in what it seemingly explores. It says, Midnight is the Darkest Hour is an examination of the ways we've come to expect love, religion, and stories to save us, the lengths we have to go in order to take power back, and the monstrous work of being a girl in this world. So there is a lot to unpack there. From those themes, I'm also getting echoes of something like The Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson, which I absolutely love, and just kind of this exploration of extremism and how that kind of coincides with the supernatural in some ways, and this kind of sense of control and control of groups ghosts and just a lot of things. So I definitely think that this is something that's going to be high on my list this fall, and I have started to see it kind of poking out a lot more online. So I think that this is going to be high on a lot of people's lists. And then staying in line with seemingly small town horror, we have Edenville by Sam Rebelin, which follows an author who had disappointing sales on his debut novel. So when he is invited to a writers in residence program at Edenville College, which does beg the question of like, how small is the community? But the blurb does make it feel like more small town with words like picturesque, which to be fair could be anywhere. However, he is invited to this residency and it makes him feel like his luck is turning around or there is some hope. However, his wife comes from either Edenville or a nearby community and has some reservations, having known the history or some of the history of this place. So despite this seemingly picturesque environment, Cam and his girlfriend, not his wife, correction, are thrust into this history. What is especially interesting for me in the blurb is that it talks about horror and humor in the kind of approach of this book. So I'm very interested to see how that is going to be balanced, because I think when done well, that really, really works. If you're looking at something like The Library at Mount Char, which is weird and dark and disturbing, but also has these threads of kind of dark humor, which to be fair, isn't explicitly a horror, but still, additionally, with that kind of addition of humor into the mix, we have the potential to be a little bit more campy if done right. But then in a seemingly a little bit more traditional horror vein, or at least that is presumably what is intended, we have A Haunting on the Hill by Elizabeth Hand. This is the first official estate-approved continuation of Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, and is a further entry into my confusion between the Shirley Jackson novel and the board game Betrayal at House on the Hill, which is clearly modeled after Hill House. And this is following a struggling playwright who has received a grant to develop their play The Witch of Edmonton and stumbles across Hill House. And with the begrudging approval of her girlfriend, they rent this house out for a month and, along with the troupe of actors, settle in to presumably workshop this play before they start kind of experiencing the oddness of the house and the things stalking the grounds and how they are soon pitted against each other. As someone who does know a decent amount about the new play development process and about creatives, whether they be playwrights or actors, I am fascinated by this premise. I'm also fascinated by the idea of the play in this book, because you've probably heard me talk about how I'm really interested in the kind of supernatural on stage. I wish I had the guts to sit through a horror in production. I could not see something like The Woman in Black on stage. I'm too much of a weenie for it, but I really love plays that kind of utilize the form and that kind of bleeding of space in the immediacy of theater to kind of explore more experimental things and kind of make the point more. And so the way that this is used in the book, I am very intrigued by, or I should say the way it will be used in the book, I'm going to be very intrigued by. And then it also has the potential to break down these characters quite a lot, as anyone who has had to sit through an early morning acting class where you are kind of picking apart your deepest fears and insecurities could tell you. Now, I granted and gratefully never had that kind of acting class, but I also wasn't an acting student. All of that aside as well, it is a huge deal that this is approved by the estate and that this is somewhat officially a continuation of Hill House, which looms so large in the public consciousness, especially after the television show, whether people know Shirley Jackson's work outside of it or not, or even are aware of the book. And even I wouldn't sit here and claim to know Shirley Jackson well enough, but I also love Shirley Jackson's work, especially her short stories and not just The Lottery. So I think that this is a huge deal. Hill House is one of the giants of the haunted house genre, and it has a lot to live up to. So I'm going to be very, very interested to hear the conversation around this, to hear the reception, if people are responding well to it. But I really, really want for this to be a win. I'm very excited for this. I think it has a lot of potential. I also think that it has a lot to live up to, like I said. So we'll see where it falls, but definitely have my eye on this one. And then to kind of take a break from the haunted house and the gothic, but still keep ourselves very rooted in that kind of fall literary fiction. We have Meanwood by Nicola Griffith, or at least I think that's how it's pronounced. And this is very much literary historical fiction. This is the sequel or continuation of Hild, which I'm going to be honest, I have not read, but it was a huge book when it came out and has kind of persisted in that. It is a deeply engrossing historical fiction that is taking a look at like medieval England. History nerds, I say lovingly, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong there, but this is definitely kind of looking at the political tumultuousness of that time through this very particular character. I definitely have seen this kind of compared in terms of scope and epicness to Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall series. So yeah, definitely something I continue to have on my radar. There has been a long wait between book 1 and book 2. And by long wait, I mean like a decade. And this was one of those books that right out of college, I was hearing talked up on like Book Riot a lot. So if you have read this book and really have strong feelings either way about it, and by this book, I mean Hild, not the second because it's just coming out, let me know if I should keep this on my TBR, if I should bump it up, really try and focus and swing back to it, because it does seem to be a kind of historical fiction that I really enjoy and haven't been going back to as often within the last few years especially. So definitely let me know if you think I should swing back to that one, but we've got book 2 for those interested. And yes, we still are on October 3rd as a kind of like visual reference. This is all October 3rd. I know, very official system here. And then after that brief historical fiction hiatus, we are going right on back to a haunted house for October, because of course we are, with Alex E. Harrow's anticipated release, Starling House. This is of course the author of The 10,000 Doors of January and The Once and Future Witches. So she does this kind of fantastical, almost storybook-esque kind of exploration and narrative really well. And here she is tackling the haunted house, but seems to have a bit of a twist. The house in question is the estate of a reclusive 19th century author and illustrator who wrote a tale called The Underland and then disappeared. And the community around this house has kind of decided it's best that the house and its heir, Arthur, is left alone. So our protagonist, Opal, according to the blurb, knows better than to mess with haunted houses, but a job opportunity appears that is too good to pass up and offers the opportunity for her and her brother to escape this town. But then Starling House seems to feel like home. So I'm very interested in what kind of twist on the haunted house story this is going to offer, because it seems to be kind of subverting it in some way, or is it? I don't know. So I definitely think this is going to be one of the buzzier books of October, especially with her track record of previous releases, and especially because the Underland has to come into play at some point in this book. We're all in agreement on that, right? So very interested in particular into how that's going to come into play, and whether this house is a kind of like portal of sorts to this other world. We know she can do a portal, but we'll see what this ends up being. And then we have Lore Olympus Volume 5 by Rachel Smythe. Don't really have a whole lot to say about this one. It's the continuation of the series. You know what you're in for if you've been keeping up. If you haven't been keeping up, definitely swing back and check out Volume 1. It is a graphic novel reinterpretation of Hades and Persephone, and based on the fact that we are at Volume 5, can confirm it is a slow burn. Now, it is a webtoon originally, so I believe that the narrative is further along than this Volume 5, but I've just been keeping up with it on the volume releases and not based on the webtoon, so I am surely behind. And then we have The Voice Upstairs by Laura Weymouth, which I am very excited for, because while the blurb does feel like it's going to be different tonally than my two favorites of hers, The Light Between Worlds and A Treason of Thorns, this also seemingly has elements of both of those books that I really enjoy, as well as elements I just enjoy in fiction, period. It's set in 1920s England, and our protagonist Wilhelmina can see spirits exit a body days before they die, but she is never able to prevent these deaths. And this has left her as kind of an outcast, with her only friend being the youngest son of a nearby lord. And so when someone at the estate dies in a mysterious way that is similar to her own mother's death, she takes on a housekeeper's position to kind of help get closer and try and figure out what is happening. Meanwhile, her friend Ed is trying to hide that he is absolutely in love with Wilhelmina, so we have that boy falls first dynamic that hopefully is resolved in some way, but he is also seemingly haunted by the ghost of his brother, and he's worried that the fact that Wilhelmina cannot see this ghost means that he might be losing his mind. So together they are left trying to unearth the secrets of these mysteries that may place them closer to danger than they think. This seems like it's going to have the gothic leanings of A Treason of Thorns combined with the kind of historical rooting that we see in The Light Between Worlds and that real deep character work that is evident in both. And I'm just very, very excited for this book. I also am a sucker for a book where someone can see spirits or interact with spirits in some way. Maybe it's just harkening back to my own young adult days as a reader of the Mediator series, but I am definitely on board. And then we have a nonfiction title that I am going to have to read off, extremely online, The Untold Story of Fame, Influence, and Power on the Internet by Taylor Lorenz. This is written by a pretty prominent online culture journalist, although I have not read a lot of her work, so I can't speak to how she's going to position things in this book, but I'm very interested in books that kind of dig into cultural phenomenon. From what I've seen of this really does focus on kind of the influencer era, but I'm not mad about that because I don't really know a whole lot about early influencers and how everything kind of shifted and when it shifted. I remember very specifically being a bookseller when YouTube really became big in the sense that there were big names that were getting publishing deals that we were carrying in store, that were driving sales in store, and I was trying to position who these creators were. Now, a lot of these creators have fallen since then, but at the time I realized I just didn't have a knowledge base or an awareness to work off of and was kind of fascinated by where that shift had happened from YouTube as I experienced it and interacted with it when it first kind of came on the scene to kind of falling off in college and, you know, watching music videos or whatever, but not really paying attention to the rise of the influencer. And I remember reading a book at the time and then realizing as I was reading it, because I was trying to kind of understand what was happening, and then I realized that the author worked at YouTube, and so there was a bias in the presentation, and I had to then take everything with a grain of salt because it wasn't really interested in kind of digging in to the pros and cons of this kind of landscape. So I'm going to be very interested to see how this information is presented, how it's kind of historically drawn, and how it kind of frames us within our current moment and how we got here. So definitely something I am interested in. We'll probably do this on audio because I love kind of like pop culture history or pop culture explorations in audio. And I mean, this is kind of towing the line between pop culture and social commentary, but I guess we'll see where on the line that falls. And then we have a contemporary romance whose upcoming release is taking especially TikTok by storm, Wildfire by Hannah Grace. This is the author of Icebreaker, which I still have not read, and it is listed in the same series and world as Icebreaker. It follows two camp counselors who reconnect at summer camp after having a passionate one-night stand where they had no expectation of ever seeing the other again, and then rekindle this romance presumably at summer camp. And then we have the newest from Brandy Colbert, The Blackwoods, which follows three young women in a famous Black Hollywood family as they struggle with fame and legacy and the blending of the public and the private. Following three young women here will be giving us three distinct point of views, and some of these young women are from different generations as well, so we'll be able to look at different generational points of view as well. I definitely think this is going to be interesting for anyone fascinated by Hollywood, the conversations around nepotism and nepo babies we've been having within the last year, or even fans of earlier this year's The Davenports. And then finally, for the third, we have Before the Devil Knows You're Here by Alison Krauss, which is seemingly a kind of historical folk fantasy set in 1836 in the Wisconsin countryside territory. And it follows Catalina, who has just been orphaned, and then a mysterious creature, man appears and steals her younger brother, and this figure is referred to as the Man of the Sap, and so she goes on a journey to rescue her brother, and this journey puts her in contact with a young Paul Bunyan as they travel after the Man of the Sap and are driven deeper into the woods and learn more about the history of this man. The blurb also mentions Faustian elements, which isn't necessarily surprising given the context of everything outlined, but I am definitely interested in this kind of bleeding of magic and folklore here. I mean, folklore generally has some element of magic in it as well, but especially this particular brand of American folklore of sorts that seems to be what we're pulling from the most in terms of the appearance of Paul Bunyan anyway. So very interested to see what this is. And of course, we've got the woods and a literal Man of the Sap, so some kind of transformation is surely going to occur. And with that, we're all the way to October 10th, and we have so many more release days this month to go, so buckle in. I'm going to try and keep it short and sweet, I promise, but you know me. So the first book of this week is dealing with something probably none of you want to hear about, which is Christmas. Believe me, I don't want to hear about it either. But for when you're ready, this is now on your radar, The Christmas Swap by Talia Samuels. It involves newly single, high-powered businesswoman because, of course, it is a Christmas romance. Margot, who agrees to go home with sweetheart Ben to pose as his girlfriend for a couple of weeks, only to fall in love with his sister. And then we have Queen Hereafter by Isabel Schuler, which is a kind of more historically rooted, from what I am gathering from the blurb, reclaiming, reimagining of Lady Macbeth. It's being compared on the blurb to things like Ariadne and Electra, which makes sense because the kind of reclaiming of women in popular Greek mythology has been a very popular subject for the last however many years. However, the book that I thought of immediately when looking at this blurb was The Lost Queen, which was a kind of more historically rooted reimagining of the Merlin mythology. And so I think that this is definitely going to take us more into the history of the happenings around Macbeth than even I surely am aware of, because I am more aware of the play than the actual historical accuracies of the story that inspired the play. So I'm very interested in what this is going to be, because Lady Macbeth is one of the most notorious fictional women and the most notorious and complicated women that we have, especially on stage. There is so much going on with her and we see so little of it. So to be able to more fully draw her will be incredibly interesting, especially if we're going to be seeing her outside of simply her marriage, as this book implies. So very, very intrigued by this one, and is another kind of entry in that darker kind of historical fiction vein for the fall. And then for a slight tonal shift, if you want something a little less dark for the fall, because you don't only have to read dark in the fall, or if you want it for later, we have the newest from beloved author Kacen Callender, who wrote Felix Ever After, and his new book is Stars in Your Eyes, which is an adult romance following a celebrity bad boy and his new co-star. And our celebrity bad boy has been caught kind of bad-mouthing his new co-star and saying that he isn't talented, which leads to them having to fake a PR romance to kind of save the reputation of the production. But of course, real feelings and real vulnerabilities are soon at play as well. So if you have been craving a new celebrity romance, this is one I definitely, anyway, am going to pick up, so maybe you would be interested as well. And then we have The Bell in the Fog by Love A.C. Rosen. This is the second in the Andy Mills mystery series, which is the sequel to Lavender House. Now, I am still staring at a copy of Lavender House that I have yet to read, but I'm still very much intrigued by this historical queer mystery series, which really do seem to grapple, especially in the blurb of this book, with the historical nuances and the societal realities of living as a queer man at this time and how that would impact an investigation. And this book, set in 1950 San Francisco, involves what appears at first to be a pretty straightforward blackmail case that becomes more complicated and pushes our protagonist into the closeted world of the Navy, as well as the gay bar scene in San Francisco at the time and the wider world of San Francisco in the 1950s. So very interested to really dive into this series. I know I need to get to it. There are so many books I need to get to, but one I definitely still have on my list. These books are also pretty short for mysteries, so I presume that they move very quickly and are very engaging because of that. So they seem like books I should be able to easily slip into my reading time, and I do aim to do that. And then we have Blackouts by Justin Torres. I apologize for my inability to roll my R's there, as well as my inability to really articulate what the blurb of this book is getting at. It seems like a very abstract yet personal book. It has been nominated for a National Book Award, so this is definitely something that I have my eye on. Again, I'm just going to read the last sentence of the blurb, which speaks to kind of the more thematic explorations here. It insists that we look long and steady at the world we have inherited and the world we have made, a world full of ghostly shadows and flashing moments of truth. And it does seem like it's going to be very experimental in its form, though I cannot articulate what that is going to look like because I haven't read it yet, and I can't really parse what the blurb is making of that yet. It may end up being something like Samantha Schweblin, where it is an experience that kind of washes over you, and I at least have never been able to fully unpack verbally in a way that fully makes sense. So I don't know, I guess we'll see, but I am very excited to try. And then we have Bittersweet in the Hollow by Kate Pearsall, which seems to be one of those like realistic, fantastical kind of narratives where it's that bleeding of the real and the supernatural. It follows Lyndall, who lives in a rural community surrounded by the national forest, and like her sisters, she has abilities. Her ability is she is able to taste the feelings of others, and a year ago this ability had driven a wedge between her and this guy Cole. It doesn't say whether they were dating at the time or not, and she is driven into the forest and comes back without any memories and only questions and nightmares. And so a year later, when another girl disappears into the forest and does not make it out, she is left with even more questions. And so she enlists the help of her sisters to go into the forest to solve what she believes to be a murder, though there are also family secrets at play, as well as a legendary mythical moth-winged man. So this is seemingly going to dive into secrets and horrors with a mythical twist. And then switching tone completely again for a second, we have another nonfiction title that I have been highly anticipating and had kind of lost track of, and so am very, very excited to read this month. Opinions, A Decade of Arguments, Criticism, and Minding Other People's Business by Roxane Gay. This is her first essay collection since Bad Feminist, and Bad Feminist was such a revolutionary title for me when I first read it, and just its bleeding of pop culture and analysis and cultural criticism, it was just such a touchstone for me. I haven't revisited the collection for a while, and it's been about a decade again since it came out, so I am so excited to see what Roxane Gay touches on here, and am just ecstatic to get more long-form essays from her in this format again, and we'll see what we get. And then another romance, we have the newest in Chloe Ulysses' The Wilmot Sisters series, which is a retelling of The Taming of the Shrew. And as we discussed when we talked about Dating Dr. Dill last year, there are a lot of challenges in adapting that for modern audiences, particularly as a rom-com. So I will be very interested to see how she approaches this text and how it serves our characters, what beats stay, what beats change, or if it's a little bit more of a loose interpretation, even though the names are direct references of the characters in The Taming of the Shrew. So we'll see what we get here. And then we have Last to Leave the Room by Caitlin Starling. This is the author of The Death of Jane Lawrence, and I am so excited to get another book from her because I thought that The Death of Jane Lawrence was just so interesting and immersive, and this is a completely new kind of point of view, but also still very much in line with what we got there. The Death of Jane Lawrence was much more of a kind of gothic romance, kind of typical haunted house horror of a sort. This feels a little bit more supernatural sci-fi and is dealing with doppelgangers and potentially alternate universes. And I find it especially interesting because our protagonist is described at the beginning of the blurb as arrogant and selfish. So we seemingly have an unlikable female character at the head here, and her doppelganger is described as a much more pleasant person. And so I think we are really going to be digging into and exploring what is accepted of women in their demeanors, how women present and are received, and the idea of unlikable female characters at all. And there's also these external stakes of a city that is sinking, and the longer the doppelganger exists, the more our protagonist forgets, loses track of time, as well as their employer is becoming more suspicious. So there is seemingly an escalation and a race against the clock amidst everything. So I am very excited for this potential. Like I said, it seems like it is going to be tonally very similar and very different at the same time from The Death of Jane Lawrence, and so I am very excited to see what this is going to end up being. And then we have graphic novel Brooms by Jasmine Walls and illustrator Teo Duvall, which is billed as a queer, witchy Fast and Furious and takes place in an alternate history 1930s Mississippi, the alternate part being the addition of magic. And it seems to really be exploring some of the complex issues, especially related to race at this time and in this place, in relation to magic and restrictions on magic. And amidst this, we have this group of girls who get together to race brooms, even though, as the blurb says, unsanctioned broom racing is banned. So we're seemingly seeing them navigate the complexities of their life against the backdrop of this broom racing, and I am very excited to see what this is going to look like. The art looks really beautiful from the cover, and I am excited to see how that translates throughout the entire graphic novel. And then we have another historical romp, Charming Young Man by Elliot Shaver. This follows a musical prodigy Leon, who is billed as France's next great pianist, and amidst making his way in Parisian society of the 1890s, including attempting to find a patron, he meets up with gossip columnist Marcel Proust, presumably that Proust, but I have no evidence proving so yet, and he finds himself being pulled further and further into society. But the closer he comes to realizing his dreams, the further he feels from his former life, his family, and the boy he may love. I'm especially excited for this one because it is a historical fiction with a setting we haven't really seen for a while, if ever, at least in my reading experience. So it's definitely going to offer a new perspective, and I'm very excited to see what it ends up being. And then from author Alexandra Christo, who wrote To Kill a Kingdom, we have The Night Hunt, and this follows a monster who feeds on fear, who must team up with a herald who has been punished for a crime he cannot remember in order to band against the old gods who have ruined both of their lives and set out on a series of quests. And like To Kill a Kingdom, this definitely feels tinged by darkness and is exploring angrier, more complex female protagonists. Not that other female protagonists aren't complex, but just that we're exploring creatures considered monsters by folklore or their respective worlds within the narrative. So very interested to see what world this builds. With To Kill a Kingdom, we had some more established lore that we were twisting, so we were still pulling from something that felt very familiar, and there is a familiarity here, but it seems to be deviating a little bit and setting up its own kind of mythology within this world, so I am very interested to see what that is going to look like. I'm hoping that some of the writing style and tone that we had in To Kill a Kingdom will translate to this, because I really, really enjoyed that book and the writing there, so we'll see what it'll be. But it also feels somewhat reminiscent to me of something like Lanny Taylor, which is always something I'm interested in exploring narratively, so excited for sure. And finally for the 10th, we have Family Meal by Brian Washington. I still have only read a lot by him, but Memorial made a lot of waves when it was released, and this is taking a look at a man, Cam, whose life is kind of in shambles after the death of the love of his life, whose ghost won't leave him alone. A haunting that, as described by the blurb, does not seem to be symbolic. And in the wake of this, he finds himself moving back to Houston and having to face off with the history with his former best friend TJ, and they're both kind of left grappling with their relationship and how to move forward. Washington really excels in navigating the nuances of these kinds of relationships, and I'm very excited to see the kind of interpersonal dynamics that are explored here. And if you're looking for something that has ghosts that isn't so much spooky, though probably emotionally a little spooky, this may be the one for you. And with that, we have successfully moved on to October 17th. Luckily, the rest of the month is not as heavy as those first 2 weeks. It really feels like they're trying to pack as much as they can into those release days, presumably because it kind of evens out with the rest of the year. I don't know. But the first release of the 17th is a new romantic comedy from Alexis Hall, 10 Things That Never Happened, which is an amnesia romance, or a fake amnesia romance. And we've also got the Best American Short Stories collection for 2023 coming out this day. It is edited this year by Min Jin Lee, author of Pachinko. So if you like short stories, if you like being up on what's current, if you're just interested in what this author would gather into a collection, this is something to definitely check out. And then today we also have another gothic-tinged dark academia release with All That Consumes Us by Erica Waters. It follows an elite collegiate academic society that our protagonist Tara does not hesitate to join. After she does, her writing becomes dark. She feels kind of weighted down by her dreams, and she feels like she's being stalked or haunted by a dark presence within the halls of her Victorian dormitory, which of course leads her to a dark secret. The blurb talks about it blurring the lines of reality, something I think is common among a lot of the releases this month and something I really gravitate toward, and also that it explores that kind of inevitable price of power, even if we don't know the cost at the outset. Moving on to October 24th, we have Organ Meats, a new novel by author K-Ming Chang, which is seemingly just as odd and transformative as her first novel, mentioning dog-headed women and women-headed dogs, and a couple of girls that are so close that when they are separated, one slips into a coma that the other has to rescue them from. So I anticipate this being very fluid and genre-bending in many ways, as well as experimenting with structure like we've seen from her earlier work, and very interested in seeing what this looks like. And then because we can't ignore a historical romance completely, completely, we have The Duke Starts a Scandal by Sophie Jordan. Now, I will admit, Sophie Jordan has been pretty hit or miss with me in terms of her historical romances, and I didn't really love the pacing of last year's, but I'm very intrigued by the premise of this year's as well as the cover. Now, I have heard from people on Twitter that the imagery of the cover is a little misleading and that we don't really get a scenario that plays out as the cover would imply, but this book follows a newly minted duke who needs to marry an aristocratic lady and instead gets the hots for his housekeeper. And then we have A Memoir of My Former Self, A Life in Writing by Hilary Mantel. Hilary Mantel passed last year and is most known for her Thomas Cromwell series, the Wolf Hall series, and it was a huge loss as she was an enormous talent. And so this is a compiling of a lot of her essays and other writings, particularly from newspapers to my understanding, to kind of like track her life in writing. And so I am very excited to see these compiled and to be able to read her point of view on more contemporary topics and just get a bigger sense of her as a writer and as a human. So it will be just a kind of balm to the loss. And then a book that probably needs no introduction, The Woman in Me by Britney Spears. That's all I really need to say, I think, but I definitely anticipate any revelations in this book dominating the news cycle after its release. And then a release that could almost be called serendipitous with all the recent talk of how often men think about the Roman Empire, a book about the Roman Empire from renowned historian and author of SPQR. We have Mary Beard's Emperor of Rome, which is a kind of look at all of the emperors of Rome to my understanding. So everything we are told men are commonly thinking about according to the most recent meme. Now, I have no comments on the veracity of how often men are thinking of the Roman Empire, but I can tell you as a former bookseller that SPQR was a very popular book when it came out. So based on that, I definitely anticipate this doing well also, and I'm interested to know if kind of the jokey discourse will help drive book sales here, because maybe it will, I don't know. And then lastly, for the 24th, we have the latest in Ashley Herring Blake's Bright Falls series, Iris Kelly Doesn't Date, which apparently involves a disastrous hookup and a fake showmance. So we're gonna have lots of drama of various kinds at play here. And then finally, we have made it to October 31st, which is a new release Tuesday this year. You would think because it's Halloween that there are going to be a lot of spooky books released on this day, but there aren't as many spooky books released on this day, presumably because publishers want time over the month for people to pick up the spooky books and read them. However, there are still a couple of books with spooky tinges, including the first release of the week, which despite that whole caveat is a horror, The Reformatory by Tananarive Due, which takes place in 1950s Jim Crow, Florida, where 12-year-old Robbie is sentenced to a reformatory school. And Robbie can see ghosts or haints, which has historically been a comfort for him, but when he enters this school, boys start going missing, and amidst these missing boys, haints start appearing to Robbie, hinting at greater dangers and leaving Robbie scrambling to survive. This definitely feels like a darker horror version of the Nickel Boys. It's going to be searing, and it's going to be grappling with a lot of American history that, by all accounts, should be haunted. We then have What the River Knows by Isabel Ibanez, which follows a 19th century heiress in Buenos Aires who has everything she wants except her parents' home. And after their tragic deaths, she, along with her new guardian, travel to Egypt, where she also has in possession a ring her father had left in her protection before his death. And this ring and the old world magic it's connected to opens up more revelations about the truth of her parents' death, and it pushes her on an adventure where she learns she can't necessarily trust everyone she thought she could, and also puts her on the path of a potential rivals to lovers relationship. So this feels like it's going to be full of wonder and magic and mystery and adventure. I've been meaning to read Ibanez's work for a while, and so I am very excited to dive into this one and also to swing back to all of the titles I've missed so far, because they all seem like they're going to be playing in the realm of magic and wonder and myth, and that is definitely something I am on board for. Which leaves us with 2 books left for the month, both of which have an element of the odd to them. I mean, to be fair, a lot of books this month have had some element of the odd. But the first is The Glutton by A.K. Blakemore. This is the author of The Manning Tree Witches, which you may remember I picked up during Indie Bookstore Day last year, but have not read yet. The blurb is definitely reminding me of perfume in some ways in relation to the kind of darkness and also the kind of oddness that is kind of contrasting these really horrific actions. This is set against the backdrop of the French Revolution, so we're going to have presumably that exploration of gluttony in relation to extreme wealth and privilege contrasted with those who have nothing, which I think is incredibly present in the modern moment and very much kind of speaking to, at least in the theatrical sense, when we ask the question, why this play, why here, why now, we have a very tangible reason we can kind of point to in terms of similar thematic explorations. Now, I was initially pretty hesitant, and because I have not read this yet, I do still have reservations around the kind of concept of gluttony, because I think in kind of modern conversations, this is kind of hard to remove from fat shaming and diet culture kind of mentalities. And this was one of the things that ruined the end of Piranesi for me, this very fleeting kind of symbolic moment where kind of fat shaming was introduced as this kind of visual shorthand for gluttony and this idea of greed and power in whatever way. Here we seem to have the kind of visual inverse in that we have this man locked away for seemingly horrific crimes, wasting away despite this insatiable hunger. And I think that that's a much more interesting visual image and is much more symbolically layered. I do not know if this novel is based in any historical truth, if it's based on a real particular figure. I will be very interested to explore that after having read the book, but I think there's a lot of potential here for a dark and disquieting historical fiction that is also reflecting in some way the contemporary moment. So very interested in what the reception of this is going to be and if it manages to escape some of the pitfalls. I really hope it does in terms of how gluttony is approached in this, and just thinking of all of the baggage that comes with that conceptually as well. So there is a lot of potential, there are a lot of seeming pitfalls, but I am very interested to see where it is going to land. And like I said, it very much feels tonally reminiscent of something like Perfume, which was dark and twisted and interesting, if you have for some reason not read that yet. And speaking of kind of dark and twisted historical fiction, we finally have a new novel by Edward Carey, author of Little, the kind of reimagining of Madame Tussauds history, which was also set during the French Revolution and had such a unique tone to it. It was a dark, almost humorous, it was kind of tongue-in-cheek, but also kind of gross and very visceral in a lot of ways. It writes the kind of coarseness of the human body and the kind of shock of the coarseness of the human body, the disgust of that, in a way that I think so many narratives really try to do, and I think it succeeds very well at that. So I have been eagerly anticipating a kind of follow-up because it was such an immersive historical fiction. It really, really stood out. I really enjoyed it. It was twisted and weird. So I am very excited to dive into his new book, Edith Holler, which also seems like a twisted and weird historical fiction. This takes place in 1901 after the death of Queen Victoria, and our protagonist, Edith Holler, lives within Holler Playhouse, and her father has told her that the playhouse will literally crumble if she leaves. So we already have these kind of odd and weird stakes at the outset of the premise. So amidst this very confined environment, she still has a very oversized and expansive imagination, and she decides to use this imagination to write a play about a legendary kind of horrific figure that uses the blood of children to make this spread. So when her father announces his engagement to the heir of this spread's fortune, she is left scrambling to protect what she deems hers. This book also will feature Edward Carey's very famous illustrations, famous in the sense that he is famous for the addition of the illustrations in his narratives, not that they have been seen before, or at least I have not seen them before. So I'm very interested to see what this looks like, especially if we are looking at this within the limitations of a theater, if we're going to see elements of Edith's script evident in the narrative, if there's going to be this playing with form, what the kind of small world of this book is going to mean for the narrative, and also for the imagination of both our protagonist and the storytelling. Also the idea that we've got this local urban legend at play. Again, I do not know if this particular story is based on similar true historical events, but I am very excited to see what kind of twisted tale we get here, because while I cannot guarantee much from this book, not having read it, I can pretty confidently guarantee it's going to be somewhat twisted in some way. And with that, we have successfully made our way through all of October's anticipated releases. Hopefully by this point, I will have succeeded in condensing this pretty considerably. There is a lot on the radar for this month, a lot to be excited about. So please, please let me know below what you are anticipating, what you're excited about, something that's already on your radar, something that this video may have sparked your interest in. Let me know. But as always, I really appreciate you hanging out. Like and subscribe as always if you feel like it, but it really does help out the channel. Most importantly, as always, read something good. And yeah, bye.